right, I'm now joined by Dasha Nekrasova from the Red Scare podcast. How did I do on the name?
Great. Nailed it.
Outstanding. One reason that I wanted to talk, beyond just the fact that, I'm sure it'd be an interesting conversation, is that in the last few days since the riot at the Capitol on Wednesday, part of the reaction to that has been this big purge of a bunch of Twitter accounts, and mostly those have been, accounts of people who are, right-wing people who I don't particularly like, and so I can sort of understand the reaction of some people to that, which is to say, yeah, great, right? People we don't like are getting screwed. This is good,
right?
But I do tend to think that that's a little short-sighted in a couple of ways.
Exactly.
And one small thing, and I don't think we should exaggerate like how big a thing this is, because I think you told me that you guys weren't really using it in any case. But one I think small symptom of that is that the in whatever happened, whatever kind of who knows what human being, what algorithm, how they do these things, it's all in a black box. But that in the sweeping up of all of these right-wing accounts, the Red Scare, not your or Anna's personal ones, but the Red Scare podcast feed got taken out, which I tend to think is like a very small sign of something that we could start to see a lot more of.
Yeah. We don't know. It's all very opaque. Like no one really knows why accounts are getting taken down, and we hadn't used that account in over a year probably. So it's possible that maybe algorithmically, I saw Glenn posted that a lot of like right-wing accounts were falling really drastically in follower counts. And so I think, I don't know, part of me thinks that purging inactive accounts is a way of also making it seem like they're taking more substantive action than they actually are. And that maybe the Red Scare Pod account was a casualty of something like that.
Yeah.
But it's impossible. We didn't get any notification or anything. It just is suspended. So we don't really know why.
Yeah. So, right. Like, I mean, that makes sense, right? They have to show that they've done something. So, it could very well be that like part of the algorithm for deciding, what to purge is that like anything with some keywords that hadn't been used in 6 months is a nice like thing that people probably aren't going to get too upset about it, but they could also say, hey, we're taking this so seriously, we just got rid of a zillion accounts.
Yeah, but this happened on Reddit a couple months ago. They took the Chapo and the Comtown Reddits down. And the Red Scare one evaded suspension in that case. But also our Shopify store was deplatformed after we unveiled our ISIS parody shirts. And that was suspended, I think, due to like mass reporting. So it's possible that our Twitter was also reported, but I imagine they would have reported our personal accounts as well.
Yeah, which is also something that's, I think like a slightly creepy aspect of a lot of this tech censorship, that if lots of people report something, or sometimes even I think not that many people report something, then like can just trigger an action that maybe no human being is even initially involved in, or if there is a human being involved in, it comes down, later in the pike, right? So there's a last, I don't know, in 2019, there was a video that I did for Zero Books that was a response to something that Ben Shapiro had said, which, and so it was called, Ben Shapiro was wrong about Israel and American Jews, and it was flagged as hate speech, even though it was like the most like anodyne, nerdy, pedantic, explanation of what was wrong with what it said. But then, and I felt like, okay, I could sort of understand what went on there. But then my editor, Doug Lane, filed an appeal, on YouTube, from what happened. And then he got a message back saying that it had been manually reviewed, and they were upholding it. And I remember thinking, how is that possible that a human being looked at this video and decided to do this? And it doesn't make sense to me for the longest time. And then all I could think is, oh, right, whoever is doing this, they probably have like 900 videos to review that morning. And so they just clicked on it for like 2 seconds. They saw the word Jews.
Yeah, exactly. They're probably in like Bangladesh or something and had just seen like a baby torture video or something.
right. Yeah.
Though it does say that our Twitter was suspended for violating the Twitter rules. And as far as I know, not using an account is not a violation of their terms of use. So, yeah, it's very opaque.
Yeah, they just had rules. They didn't say which rule.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then when you click through the Twitter rules, it's hate speech, etc. But as far as I know, the Red Scare account hasn't violated any of those because we used it primarily for like promoting the episodes when we first started the pod.
Yeah. And I know, of course, that when this example, came up, I think I saw that it happened because Branko Marcetic, who's a staff writer for Jacobin, had tweeted out, the screenshots of the thing saying that it had been suspended. And then a lot of people's, reaction that I saw was, oh, this probably like, they probably really did, even though, as you say, you hadn't even used it for a year, it's like they probably did something really incendiary on it, because I think that there's a sort of view that some people have about Red Scare that's like, I don't know, like like I'll see people say things like, oh, this is like red-brown politics or Strasserites, yeah, which is amazing because that like. Right, so Otto Strasser was leading this like faction of the Nazi Party in the 20s, maybe into the early 30s, who was wanted to use more like socialist kind of rhetoric, and so somebody, unfortunately, a year or two ago, must have looked this up on Wikipedia, found out who this guy is, and forever afterwards, anybody who seems to be like not quite woke enough on some issues or something like that, but like sympathetic to socialist politics, becomes labeled as a Strasserite. And I remember like thinking, I don't listen to, Red Scare every week, but, I'll listen sometimes. And I've heard, the late, Michael Brooks was a big fan. He talked to me about it sometimes. And I remember that because the stuff was going around, I remember thinking it was really funny after like a year and a half ago, I guess, after the debate with Slavoj Žižek and Jordan Peterson in Toronto, I listened to the episode that you guys did about that. You had Amber Frost on, and I remember thinking like, okay, so over the course of the episode, since you're talking about Peterson, you bring up like trans pronoun things, and everybody on the episode agrees that, of course, as a matter of like basic like respect,
human decency,
of course, you should use people's preferred pronouns. What are you talking about, right? That just goes without saying. And I don't even remember how it came up or how it related to anything, but I remember that in that episode somehow the death penalty came up, and everybody. And all three of you are like, oh yeah, no, that's like really disturbing that exists. And I remember listening to that thinking, man, they do not make Nazis like they used to be.
Yeah, I mean, my concern was when Steve Bannon's War Room got deplatformed that us having had him on Red Scare would implicate us in some way, but thus far we haven't been faced any repercussions for it.
Yeah, and I guess the Bannon thing is part of what people are talking about. I listened to that one too, since I think when that happened, there's a lot of talk going around. I mean, whatever. If you're anybody who's on Twitter enough to not on Twitter enough to not know what I'm talking about, you're much better off, and continue to live your life that way, right? But if you are, there was a lot of stuff going on. about how okay, this proves it, right? That this
Their
see?
mask off moment, they're platforming a fascist. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Which platforming is also like a really weird word that's used in these discussions. That I think like it's one of these things that every once in a while it's good just as a check to think, okay, how would I explain what this even means to somebody who wasn't in this world, right? Like what platforming is supposed to be and why it's supposed to be bad. That you have somebody like because it's almost as if, right? Because I even saw it like with the Zizek Peterson thing. I saw like some people say, oh, Slavoj Žižek is platforming, Jordan Peterson. It's like it's like one of the best selling authors in the world. And
yeah, by debating him in a public forum.
Yeah, that this Slovenian Marxist intellectual is like giving him his big break, that by arguing with him, or similarly that like Steve Bannon, who'd been a special advisor in the White House, whatever his job was initially in the Trump administration, and who's like not a household name, but I mean anybody who's a political junkie certainly knows who he is.
Yeah.
That I mean. Whatever. I mean, there's lots of people listen to Red Scare, but I don't think that was I don't think a lot of people were finding out who Steve Bannon was for the first time
right.
by listening to Red Scare. And
if they were, I don't think they would have been radicalized by the conversation we had.
Yeah, right. In particular, I mean, what I liked about that conversation was that if you compare it to like, I remember around the same time I listened to, since whatever, I'm a strange nerd who will listen to stuff like this, that there was, I think like a year before, there was this monk debate. So the monk debates are this like this really high profile thing that happens in Toronto between Steve Bannon and David Frum, who's like a never Trump Republican. And in that debate, like all it was, right? If you haven't watched it, I'll save you the effort. All it was Bannon throwing a lot of vaguely populist rhetoric at Frum about working class deplorables, and Frum throwing a lot of rhetoric about Bannon about like Bannon being a fascist. That was the whole debate. I don't think there was ever actually any like specific like policy disagreements ever in the debate. Probably because they're both Republicans. So how much do they really disagree about? I don't know. But
exactly.
But then on the Red Scare debate, you and Anna, your co-host, kept asking Bannon this like really specific question, which is, hey, you say that you're a populist. Why don't you support Medicare for all?
Yeah, that was I'm glad that we asked him that, because he's sort of, I think I'm against deplatforming fascists, because I think if you do give them a platform, then they ultimately kind of will discredit themselves, or people should be free to draw their own conclusions from what they have to say, which in Bannon's case wasn't, anything very compelling.
Yeah, I think so, because in his response to that question, I mean, look, I listened to the whole thing, and it's, I mean, I think I remember it pretty well, but I couldn't really tell you what his end of the day response
was. I can't even remember what he said, yeah.
Because it seemed like he said a few different things, and they didn't quite add up to an answer, and then he's like, oh, here are some more Republican-friendly things we could do about healthcare. Yeah, but why not Medicare for all? I was like, I don't know, And then he never really got to like, okay, here's the bottom line reason that I don't support it. And I think what that really showed is that at the end of the day, like Bannon, he's a Republican with better marketing. Like he says deconstruct the regulatory state, and that sounds kind of radical, and depending on your position, maybe a little scary, and in a weird way, sort of like Foucault or something. But I don't know that he actually means that much that other Republicans don't mean by like deregulation.
Yeah, he's similar to Jordan Peterson in that he's really into kind of like mythologizing and talking in these really grandiose kind of mythic metaphors. But ultimately he's pretty toothless. Like he doesn't actually stand for anything. He has his whole like fourth turning philosophy, and that's all very flimsy if you actually interrogate someone on it.
yeah, it sounds like yeah, the whole fourth turning thing, it's like a little bit like there's like a certain kind of dweeby, extremely right wing person whose like Twitter avatar is like some like Greek statue or something.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
know, it's like the prose version of that. You know, that it's like that it sounds like really grandiose. It's like, oh, this is a guy. He must really know a lot about history and this and that. But it's like, okay, so what does that mean? What's the upshot of that?
Yeah. It's like astrology, basically, at the end of the day.
Exactly, astrology for the far right. Yeah, or what what passes for the far right. Since I think Bannon is really, like I said, I mean, I think he's basically just a Reaganite Republican who likes having some like vaguely fascist sounding bluster,
Yeah.
and maybe he wants to do a little bit more, cracking down on immigrants, than might already happen. But it's like I think the actual again, I don't know how much he really disagrees with, with David Frum about, which actually does get into something else that I'd like to hear your take about, because there has been this like long-standing thing for the last like I don't know like almost 6 years, 5 years, 6 years, whatever, about Trump and fascism, and whether there's like some like real analogy there, and the version of it in the last few months is whether his many attempts to like beg somebody to let him stay being president mean that add up to being a coup, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's appropriate to call it that. And everybody I've seen, like everybody I've seen who had those positions, right? Trump is a fascist. There's this threat of fascism now that he's going to like overthrow democracy and do fascism, and this is a coup, has responded to the riot at the Capitol last Wednesday by saying, "See, we were right. Right? Check it out. Right? Here's the fascist coup."
Yeah.
And but it seems like there's a different way that you could read that, which is okay. So doesn't this show? I mean, look, if the question is like, is Donald Trump personally committed to democracy? Clearly not. But if the question is like, is he actually strong enough like to do anything? It kind of doesn't seem like it.
Yeah. The word fascism doesn't seem to refer to any material reality of his force. I don't uh, really expect. And now, well, there's all this push for impeaching him, like right near the end of his term, sort of as to set a precedent that this sort of thing is unacceptable. Um, and the situation in Capitol Hill, I mean, it's all it's confusing because it's all very mediated and hard to really understand what happened. But I think that Glenn Greenwald predicted it very presciently when he said that post-Trump, the sort of liberal establishment would find like mentally ill people to scapegoat as evidence of the looming fascist threat to justify increasingly draconian censorious measures, which now they're seem to be undertaking.
Yeah, because I mean, I can understand saying, look, it's like what happened at the Capitol. It's like incredibly disturbing. It's certainly nothing. I wouldn't pretend to be like, oh yeah, I saw that coming, right? I definitely thought that was going to happen.
Yeah.
It's like a weird escalation of anything that you could imagine happening in like 2015, whatever. Uh, Although honestly, I think the weirdest thing about it is just that it was able to happen in the Capitol. That like it seems like if there had been a right wing riot that was near the Capitol, that would have been big news, but it wouldn't have been anything that anybody experienced as apocalyptic. It,
And the response to it being immediately to it seems like a security problem, not a social media problem.
right, exactly.
I watched that Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, recently. Um, and that was essentially propaganda for this very thing. It sort of starts out with this very benign, reasonable thesis about how social media is unhealthy for us, and then uses it to draw conclusions that, yeah, the right has harnessed the forces of social media to push their like radical agenda and to manipulate reality, and that the real problem with social media is that it's not censored enough.
Yeah, which is weird, and I guess the thing that I find weirdest about it is I get people who are just like normal liberals who think that I sort of understand how that works in their minds. But as somebody who does, I mean, I know, I mean, I don't know how, I don't know exactly how you and Anna would see your relationship with like, leftism or the left, might be a little bit more, I think you might feel a lot less attached to those categories, than I would, is my strong sense.
Yeah, I mean, increasingly so. I think, 4 or 5 years ago, I wouldn't have really thought twice about referring to myself as a leftist, especially when Bernie was a viable political candidate. But post Bernie, and maybe you can illuminate for me, but I don't see really the political strategic use of identifying that way, or what it even really refers to.
Yeah, which by the way, that's, if there's one thing I know about Nazis, is that they're all really enthusiastic about Jewish social democrats. That's classic Nazi thing right there.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, look, I mean, I do think that the kind of political project that Bernie represented, having things like Medicare for all and things about housing and free college, even, I think that's overemphasized, but it's something I like.
Yeah.
Is et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like I think that's a worthwhile political project. I think it's really, I mean, look, I'm somebody who would like it if we went beyond that, right? And had I think all of that stuff would be a really good first step. But I think that for both ideological reasons and for just being able to hold on to achieving all that stuff and not having future austerity, like to go beyond capitalism, completely, right? So that's my card.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
And I guess I do think that sort of immediate Bernie-ish project, it's gone into, it's definitely suffered some huge defeats, no doubt about it, in the last couple of years. But my hope is that that doesn't mean that it's gone away for good. That it's that we, I think the sort of basic needs that it spoke to are still there, and that it,
Definitely. Yeah. Well, I felt like that after Trump was elected and we saw all these people joining the DSA and starting to identify as leftists, it was because that it was clear that there needed to be an alternative to the neoliberal agenda, and that leftism, the American left, emerged as like a space where maybe we were experimenting with that alternative being possible. But the last 4 years have just really been demoralizing. And it feels very much now that I feel very like black pilled, unfortunately, that there is no alternative.
Yeah, I mean, so I totally see where that comes from, for sure. I mean, as much as, even though I would say, like, even this year, like, Bernie Sanders did win, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and it seemed like, I mean, as hard as it is to remember, I mean, so much has gone on since then. This almost sounds like you're talking about something from the Ford administration, but like back in like February,
Yeah.
the whole mainstream discussion in the media was about, oh, if he only shows up at the convention with a plurality of the delegates, should he still get the nomination? So as distant as that feels, I mean, it did.
No, I'm from Nevada, actually, so I remember that very well, and having this real, now in retrospect, naive feeling like maybe we might win.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess, well, that's not to say that I identify with the right in any way. I still feel like I have
just
leftist values. It's just that I think it feels like I feel like dialectically frustrated or something, like it's stopped resolving itself and just sort of a moral fatigue has set in.
Yeah, yeah, no, I get that. And by the way, I mean, this is like, I think this is undeniably stupid, but just humor me for a second when
Yeah.
when you say you have leftist values, because I think there is like a lot of I think there's a lot of sort of hurting that happens, especially with the online left, in terms of like signaling and like the style and
Mhm.
the general vibe that people get from people, and then like once they've made up their minds about them, like that sort of becomes a self-perpetuating thing. So when you say leftist values, like, um I mean, is there anything actually where you think that your actual like policy positions, like what you think the laws should be, are actually very different from like what's common on the left?
Um, well, I guess what um is common on the left, if it's,
Yeah.
if the left is becoming increasingly sort of censorious and authoritarian, then that would be something that I would disagree with because I
Yeah,
do believe in like free speech as a principle.
yeah, me too. Yeah, I think that free speech is an important principle. It's one that the left should care about, because this gets us back to where we started, which is that I think that it's going to, I think these little, very small symptoms like the Red Scare Twitter account, or the Chapo and Cumtown Reddits or whatever,
Mhm.
being taken down. Um, I suspect are a very small sign of things to come. I think that if we do get like some uh, crazy new laws about domestic terrorism, which Biden has said, it would be a priority for him, and he hasn't gone into any detail. But I can't imagine that not that happening and it not being like pretty horrible, because the laws that we already have about terrorism are incredibly,
Yeah.
authoritarian and
It's hard to imagine that we could be more surveilled.
yeah, exactly. And I think that if there is some big look, I interviewed this guy Brian Atinsky, who is in who lives in America now, but he's like an anti-Zionist Israeli, like peace activist from back when, and he used to be involved in the Israeli Indie Media Center, and
Mhm.
he was telling me about these laws that were passed after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin to broaden the definition of incitement, and lots of Israeli liberals were pushing for those because of all the right-wing incitement that was leading up to the assassination of Rabin, and then like they ended up using this stuff against Atinsky and his friends, since like they published like a cartoon that had a picture of Ariel Sharon kissing Hitler or something like that.
Mhm.
That was and that was cracked down on using the incitement laws, and I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to see what the American equivalent of that might look like. That people could say, look, how here Americans, if we're broadening what counts as terrorism, then yeah, if you're like a leftist who's has any sort of 6 degrees of connection to like people beating up Proud Boys in Portland or whatever, I'm
Mhm.
sure that that's going to be applied against you. In fact, it's probably mostly going to be applied, for things like that.
You think?
I think so. I mean, like maybe not like immediately. Uh,
Mhm.
in the short term, like I could see like maybe it really will mostly be applied to the people that it's being talked about right now. But
But even so, I think that's
yeah, I think it's bad on principle, no matter who it's applied to. I think that's true. But I also think that long term, well, let's put it this way: that if it's not mostly applied against the left, that says really depressing things about the left, because that would mean that it never actually becomes a threat
well,
the
that's
to the status quo, right? It's like that's like people. There are people who say, um, like when I was talking to Natalie Wynn, she brought this up, right? That there are literally people who have both of these two positions. That they say that it should be easier for Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and all those to censor people, and they advocate like some, frankly pretty larpy in my view, but whatever, they like have some
mhm.
idea that we could have like actual like violent insurrection in the streets as like a way of bringing about socialism. And it's
Yeah.
like, how can you possibly believe both of these things? And if you do believe both of these things, it's because you think that, like, at some level, you're play acting, and you think that you just think that you're never going to rise to the level of the censor's attention.
Well, right. Or there's a kind of dissonant alarmism, and not that I don't think we shouldn't be alarmed. I think we should be vigilant, but I've seen, at least on Twitter these last few days, which people have been really nice to me, and Anna. I see why people love victimizing themselves so much, because it feels good to be to be supported. But sort of whipping up this hysteria about censorship because leftist identity depends on imagining themselves as being a threat to capital, but then doing all of this on a social media platform feels, I don't know, very like exhausting and unproductive.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess as far as this goes, like, what's going to happen? I mean, I think that if nothing else, I do think that there's a good chance, like, without being too dramatic about it, right? We don't want to, like, I'm not under any impression that, like, there are going to be, whatever, like the Department of Homeland Security is going to shut down Jacobin or something. That's never going to happen. That's not a concern that I have. But I do think that that there are certainly, even in terms of the immediate tech censorship, I think that there is an incentive to crack down on leftists, as well as the right, just for the sake of looking even-handed, if nothing else.
And that's a good point. Yeah.
And even in terms of the any new domestic terrorism laws that we might get, I think that incentive exists to a certain extent there, that the people want to show, right, that this isn't just an attempt to crack down on the right. So if you have, like, some Antifa, whatever, people being swept up in it, that helps you show that. And then also, I think that there is and then I think that, look, I mean, some of this has already happened, that, like, you've already had a certain amount of cracking down. That's there were, Trump actually did send, the Department of Homeland Security to Portland, to protect, federal property or whatever, whatever is supposed to be.
Right.
And so I think that there could be more of that. I think that how much of it there is, I think, depends on how much of a threat the left actually becomes to capital, which then I guess gets down to what we were just talking about when you say that you see, that you've become kind of black-pilled about it, that you see very little hope, for the resurrection of the kind of project that you initially saw with Bernie. Because I think that because I hope, I mean, maybe I'm just being delusional, but I mean, everything that I would do is kind of premised on the idea that could actually happen. That that the left, that some version of the left could get its shit together in the future. And if that's the case, then you look at, like, past kinds of repression that have happened with, like, McCarthyism, or COINTELPRO, all the things that were happening with the Black Panther Party, all of that stuff. Then I think there is a lot of precedent to say that if you do care about that kind of left project, you should be worried about that. You should think that, even apart from the principled arguments, which I also agree with, you should think that at the very least there's something really weird about saying, I'm totally opposed to the current structure of society. I want to, like, whatever, nationalize all this stuff. I totally oppose the powers that be. And also I trust that, that these like handful of, like, Silicon Valley, CEOs, visions that I like about who's going to get censored.
Well, that's really the other facet of the problem, right? Is that it's these private tech corporations have such a monopoly on like a public commons that isn't actually a public commons, and so we're all bound to their sort of terms of service, and that they ought to be nationalized, right?
Yeah, I think so. Because if you did, then there would actually be like legally, reasons to, like legally they'd have to protect people's free speech, that the First Amendment would apply to it, and then I mean, I'm sure you could still have some limits, the same way that you can't go to like, public comment, opportunities at City Hall or whatever, and just start like, screaming swear words and racist slurs. I'm sure you're allowed to do that, and that doesn't violate the First Amendment. But you couldn't be like dragged away just for expressing the wrong political opinion, and that's what would be good to apply to what is in effect. It's not a commons legally, but I mean in effect, in terms of its use, in terms of how much it's how important it is for the spread of information, is in effect a commons, and that's also something that I think. Look, it's one thing that to even think some of these decisions are the right decisions. I can understand that, right? Saying that after Trump egged on this riot at the Capitol, people trying to stop the certification of the electoral vote, and he didn't want the National Guard to be called to stop it, whatever. That, like, I can understand saying that it's such an extreme situation that it's like right that he's being deplatformed from all these tech companies. But what I don't understand is thinking, especially if you're leftist, thinking that it's totally cool and fine that this handful of private corporations can decide to cut off all of these major lines of communication between the president of the United States and the public, which is insane almost to say. And I see people saying things like, "Oh well, whatever," even without Facebook and Twitter and blah blah blah. He could still do press conferences. He could do this. He could do that. It's like, yeah, I'm sure that if a hypothetical, President Bernie Sanders were being accused of, I don't know, inciting, something having to do with like, general strikes, or even like, Black Lives Matter or whatever, and all of this stuff had been cut off, I'm sure all the people saying that wouldn't think that was a big deal for the same reason, like that's.
Well, yeah, if these social media platforms are sort of by design so flawed that they're compromising our democracy, I don't see how the solution is to give them more power over what happens on them. Yeah. And I mean, for me, just on a very, like, it concerns me in a very practical way, because the podcast is my livelihood.
Yeah. Yeah, right, for sure. So if that's cut off, which whether
the left is like a threat to capital or not, it's concerning, just because I don't have a safety net. This is
yeah, right. For sure, right.
I make my living like expressing occasionally dissident political and cultural thought.
Yeah, and so I did want to bore down on that like a little bit, just because I don't want, like, I think that somebody who watched or listened to this interview, I'd like anybody who's watching or listening to it who does take this kind of narrative about prosperism or whatever seriously, to have like as few excuses as possible at the end of it, to really believe it, right? So you said earlier, when you say you have leftist values, that but you don't necessarily agree with like what the left might think, insofar as a lot of the left is either like indifferent to or even cheering on some like censorship in some contexts, whether we're talking about tech companies or people being disinvited from campuses or whatever. And I'm with you on all of that. But then in terms, I think, of both all the social democratic stuff we were talking about earlier, Medicare for all, housing, education, all that stuff, and just sort of baseline, civic and legal equality, for everybody, that, that we should have that you shouldn't, we should have like government action to make sure that you're, not being fired for, being gay or trans or whatever,
Yeah, of course.
yeah, I think all of that stuff would just be, would just be a given for you. Like my sense, my strong sense is that like, I think that, I think that all that stuff is just sort of like, I think you probably regard all of that as just kind of going without saying, right? But then like if so, I think that the question is, well, hold on. So what are we talking about, right? Like if like, because if somebody wants to say, oh my God, like these people, they're Nazis or semi-Nazis, or they want to like have an alliance with Nazis or something like that. Well, first of all, I don't think that you're actually particularly in the business of having of having political alliances with anybody. I think that you're in the interest. You're in the business of doing entertaining and hopefully enlightening cultural commentary and talking.
Yeah, we definitely don't have a coherent agenda. Especially politically, I think we are more so like a cultural commentary podcast, and to the degree that we are people think that we are conservative, I think that has to do sort of with our maybe more personal social value. I know people call us trad and stuff, which is, I think the vast majority of the country wouldn't consider us trad.
Yeah. So yeah, right. Because I mean, obviously, when you're doing this interview right now, it was hard for you to get away from your 7 children.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anybody who who's ever listened to the podcast has gotten the strong impression that's what your life is like.
My husband gave me permission to come on your podcast.
Yeah, no, I got to thank him for that. Yeah. So, I mean, what is it then, right? So, like, if since clearly, you're not, you're not living that, that life, and clearly you're not, advocating any sort of right wing legal anything, then where is it that you think that that comes from?
I think it's a tone thing. I don't know. I guess, yeah, people don't like our sense of humor or something.
Which to the extent that it is about that, I have to say, like, I find that like really depressing, precisely because I'm not as black pilled about the future of the left that I really am holding out hope that it could actually get to the point of having a chance at least of actually winning political power and doing all the things that we've been talking about. But then
I mean, I think, sorry.
No, please go on.
I think honestly it's being critical of stuff like Russiagate. I think that the Trump kind of resistance narrative just had at a certain point, and still does in many ways, I think, a kind of like a zero tolerance for any sort of nuanced conversation about, because Trump is a literal fascist. So anything that is critical of the Democratic establishment that claims to oppose him becomes sort of suspect. And then when it gets wrapped up kind of with our aesthetic or tone, I think it just becomes like a vibe that people, and it's, I don't know, people do. I think that there is a really disturbing note of victimhood that people appeal to, and the real kind of undercurrent behind it is like vengeance. People, there's an incentive to victimize yourself to justify your more vengeful impulses.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people probably, like, on some level, like I think they're kind of reconciled to the idea that they're powerless as far as real world politics, that they're not really going to have
Yeah.
that much of an impact there. Which again, I mean, I really hope that that's not true in the long term. But I think a lot of people have that really strong sense. Of course, that's that's right on some level, right? That there's like that there are there are this like tiny handful of people in Congress who are somewhat identified with socialism, but like that's a tiny minority of the Democratic Party, and there's like almost no labor movement. We have like 6.2% private sector unionization, and so things are pretty grim as far as all that goes. And so I think if you feel like actually affecting big institutional changes outside of your reach, but getting people to sort of like demonizing or shunning somebody you kind of see as within your world, like media things, whatever, like that seems like a much more achievable goal. And it's one that, if nothing else, I mean, it sort of gets out that, like what you're talking about with revenge, like it's sort of like, if you basically see politics as about punishing bad people, which I think a lot of people do,
Yeah.
that it's not nearly as much about like, things that
Advocating for vulnerable people.
yeah, exactly. That it's not nearly so much about doing things that are actually going to make life better for vulnerable people, as it is about punishing people that you think are bad. Which in some ways, I mean, it kind of seems like is all over the place. I mean, like Russiagate and the Trump 2016, stuff about Hillary were both versions of this fantasy where someday in the future, your political enemies are going to be like perp walked by cops, and you'll have therefore won. You're not. It's not really about changing something in the real world. It's about the idea that the people that you hate the most are going to get their comeuppance.
Yeah.
And even if you can't get that for Trump or whatever, Jeff Bezos, if we're talking about socialists, at least if you can at least, I mean, maybe you even can't, really effectively punish, people that you see within their world, but that seems more achievable. The idea that you could like make life miserable for like somebody who's, like a podcaster or a journalist or something, like that seems like something like, yeah, no, we could do that.
Yeah. And then you have to convince themselves that they're dangerous somehow to
justify it.
Justify it. Exactly. I mean, unfortunately, that also seems like a very par for the course for the left, like eating itself, the vampire's castle, all of that. It feels like it's why it's also sad that I am hesitant to even describe myself as a leftist, because I feel and why then Angela Nagel is a really good example too of someone who was, I feel, really like unjustly sort of exiled from leftist discourse and then demonized for talking to Tucker Carlson,
Yeah, and I think there can be in some of these cases like a really bad cycle where people who feel like they've been excommunicated, then they'll just sort of go out and hang out with the people that they think will still have them, and then they'll drift into that political sphere. I'm not saying that's necessarily happened with Angela Nagel, but I think that it is something that happens. And it's also just weird that, again, I think what you're saying about how people need to paint their enemies on or adjacent to the left in a certain light in order to justify this, because like otherwise this would just be quirky behavior, to spend this time, like attacking people online that that it's like it just has no real relationship to politics at all, and that would just be obvious. So to justify it, it can't just be like, Angela Nagel is wrong about X, Y, and Z. Like,
right.
Like Angela Nagel, has a position on immigration, which I disagree with, which is true actually in that example. But that they have but it can't be that, right? Like, because that's kind of not good enough, like just to say, there's like a journalist who
Yeah.
who writes some stuff who's wrong. like that doesn't really, that's not that exciting. It can't just be, I think that she came to the wrong conclusion about this or that. It has to be that she's literally a Nazi, so it's like a moral imperative to go after her.
It's the zero tolerance for dissenting opinion. I mean, there was an anti-fascist march in New York today where people were like took to the streets and were like chanting about Proud Boys, and it felt just extremely futile and kind of like Manhattan isn't known for its roaming gangs of Proud Boys that need to be, it seemed just very, and with lockdown measures and everything too, it was just like, okay, so a bunch of people wanted to go outside today. Is that what happened?
Yeah, right. Like, and I understand saying that in a context, like like when George Floyd was murdered, and then there were all these mass protests and riots about that, and I can understand in that context saying, okay, look, I take the pandemic seriously. I don't want to spread COVID, but it's really important in this moment that there has been all this upsurge about this really important thing
to demonstrate. Yeah.
Right. Like I mean, I think different people make different decisions about, what makes sense to them. But I think like that, like in a baseline way, that makes sense to me. It makes a little bit less sense probably to do that, to march against Proud Boys that you'd have to like, get on a bus or a train to go meet any of.
Yeah, exactly. In Midtown.
Yeah, exactly.
And that vengeful streak on the left, especially the way that it also takes the form of deplatforming or getting people fired or compromising people's livelihood, feels very, very backwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very like, I mean, both, because I think there are both self-interested and principled reasons, for the left to care about free speech. And also the getting people fired stuff is particularly weird because like that seems like what you're taking advantage of when you do that is the fact that we live in this country where, overwhelming majority of people are in non-unionized at-will workplaces where bosses have this like crazy semi-feudal level of power, which is if you're a leftist, presumably one of the main things that you object to about American society. But that's what you're taking advantage of, when you dox people and get them fired. And it's something that, again, if you're doing it and you're not worried about it being turned around on you, that says really bad things about how powerless you think that you're going to be forever, that you're just not going to be enough of a threat to, to be worth bothering with.
It's very bleak. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you're not, like, God, why bother with any of this stuff? Right. I mean, like if you don't think that you're going to, if you don't think that you're ever actually going to be enough of a threat to capital that you'd be worried about, like McCarthyism, people getting having your politics and stuff like that, then why on earth would you spend your life, doing this rather than
what are we doing here? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it's also something that's like, if the goal is to get people to like, okay, so somebody has like really backward views about something that you don't like. And if the goal is to get them to change, then like, seems like the most counterproductive possible thing to do is to get somebody fired, because I don't think anybody's ever thought, like, oh, well, I guess my enemies just got me fired. That really makes me reflect on whether they're right and I'm wrong, like that's like I'm very skeptical that that's a thought that's ever gone through anybody's head.
Well, to that point also, even if these sort of the measures that will be taken by the Biden administration against domestic terrorism or the tech platforms only do end up affecting, the deplorable right-wingers that are our political adversaries, presumably, it seems like, wouldn't that just cause those forces to fester and then reemerge? Like, isn't that how we got Trumpism in the first place? None of it really makes sense.
Yeah. It's almost like this idea that by persecuting people, you're going to make them just like literally disappear, or else like I don't know, like have a change of heart or something, and none of those really make sense. That like if you're stopping short of like shooting them, then they are going to still exist. At the end of at the end of
Don't
it
give
all.
them any ideas, Ben.
But if so they are going to still exist, and be a lot more bitter. And I know what a lot of people would say at this point, is in the conversations, yeah, but you can't convince these people. And what I always want to say is, yeah, but who do you mean when you say these people? Do you mean the most like hardcore of the hardcore? In which case, sure, the most hardcore people with any position you probably can't convince. That if they end up changing their mind about something, that's going to be an incredibly long-term process. Or do you mean like, do these people mean like the 71 million people who voted for Trump in the last election? Because that's one of those things like, well, if you're writing off every single one of them, then you're clearly not serious about actually winning anything ever.
And you're willfully blind to the material needs that would cause someone to vote for, because Trump also, it's worth saying, isn't like a Republican. He ran in a very like anti-establishment kind of.
Yeah, he governed mostly like a normal Republican.
Yeah, but his base was animated because they wanted, like Michael Moore said when he got elected, to throw like a Molotov cocktail sort of into the system, that it happened, that he's a symptom, and that treating the symptom of far right extremism by silencing people isn't going to actually address the disease.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like almost on the level of thinking that like, oh, it's like we like 1970, whatever, that we can just like spend another year pouring napalm on Vietnam, and then they'll decide that they they'll give up on all the communism stuff and decide
Yeah.
the United States. I mean, it's kind of stupid on that level, and yeah, I think that's right. Like, I know that what a lot of people will say in response is, oh, if you look at like this or that polling data, then people who voted for Trump were actually, higher income, et cetera, et cetera. Some of which is true, but I think it misses the point. Which, sure, most people who voted for Trump are people who, voted for Romney or whatever, but the question is, why? Like, what about the other people who voted for him who didn't vote for Romney or whoever, right? Like that. In fact, that he ran. He, since turnout was higher all around, like he got way more people, or, the people like in 2016, he lost the popular vote, but he won these places like Michigan, which I think like the last Democrat who won was like Dukakis, maybe.
Yeah.
The last Democrat who lost, was like Dukakis, and it seems like, I don't know, a lot of people on the left seem to be really committed to saying that it's just a coincidence that, that the reason that he won those like Rust Belt swing states has absolutely nothing to do with all of the going around and talking about trade and saying he'd bring the jobs back and all of that stuff. That it's
or Hillary Clinton not going there at all.
Yeah. Well, that's
and then saying America is already great because America is good.
Yeah.
Or whatever asinine thing was that she said, that was like, just showed how completely disconnected the Democrats were from reality.
Yeah, totally. That like West Virginia, had usually gone blue, but Trump went there and said that, he'd bring the mining jobs back, which is a total lie, but but it worked. And yeah, that has a lot to do with the fact that the Obama administration's whole response to, coal miners who lost their jobs was to, plant a few like technology training centers in Appalachia, which is essentially just like an elaborate way of saying stop whining and learn to code.
Yeah.
And yeah, that wasn't a big like that clearly didn't get it done, so and it just seems like, yeah, sure. I mean, there was lots of racism, in the Trump campaign. I think that's true, but I think it's also true that it's not really that in, Michigan and Wisconsin, that like there's just randomly, more racism for some reason than in than in New York or California. That I think that you can't like really detach it, right? People turn economic anxiety into a punchline. It's like, oh, right, that's like you're just sort of trained to roll your eyes every time you hear the phrase economic anxiety. But no, seriously, like there actually like there actually is all that economic distress that is certainly at least part of this cocktail of factors, leading Trump to become president, and even all of the stupid culture war shit. Like that it is part of the reason. I mean, I think that like the Thomas Frank point, from way back when, and what's the matter with Kansas is basically right, that that there are people who are going to, if they don't really see either party as representing like the things that they want economically. And I understand when you say that there are people who'll be like, yeah, but actually, Hillary was running on doing a 2% increase to this thing or that thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, but people, you clearly don't have like an inspiring message about those issues. Like I'm an unhealthily obsessive political junkie, and I ended the 2016 election. I basically have no idea what Hillary Clinton's healthcare plan was. I know that she said she was going to do something or other to make Obamacare better.
Yeah.
I don't know what. I assume that you would have had to go on her website and find like a 50K page policy paper. So that wasn't really that compelling to most people. So if the economic message isn't very compelling, people are complicated. They think lots of different things that don't always necessarily fit together. And, and there are people who might be won over by a more compelling economic message. But if that's not on the table, then whatever their cultural grievances are, they'll just vote on the basis of that.
Yeah.
like that just seems like one of the things that always got me about this. Like, I think one of the moments in the last election cycle that disturbed me the most along those lines was when Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie Sanders.
He didn't even endorse him. He just said he liked him.
Yeah, right. He endorsed him in the sense,
Yeah,
like in a sort of typical Joe Rogan way, sort of like genially half stone kind of way. He was like, oh yeah, I'll probably vote for Bernie. He seems like a good guy, and there were a lot of people, and I understand a lot of this was like ginned up by like supporters of other candidates or whatever, but some of it was organic, right? There were people like little red rose emoji Twitter handle thing, who were saying stuff like this. We're like, oh my God, Bernie Sanders really needs to repudiate the endorsement of this fascist Joe Rogan. And it's like, yeah, look, Joe Rogan in his God knows how many hundreds of hours of podcasting, I think by his own cheerful admission, a lot of them high or out of it or another, has said tons of shit I disagree with, also tons of shit that I agree with. It's he's like a little all over the place.
He's a curious guy.
Yeah, exactly. And and it's like, yeah, he is a little all over the place, but so are most people. Most people.
I mean, he's the most popular podcaster in America.
Yeah, right, exactly. And most people, they might have political impulses, they have political reactions to things, but they don't most people don't have like a coherent worldview, because you kind of have to be a strange nerd to have that, because because most people have other things in their lives that they spend a lot more time thinking about than they think about politics.
And the world is increasingly incoherent.
Right. Yeah.
And it feels like the echo chambers are kind of just getting louder post-COVID, because people's social media feeds becomes the only thing that reality is sort of like refracted to them through, which reaffirms their biases and their incoherent worldviews.
Yeah, and that is really. Did you read Hate Inc?
I did, yeah. We had Taibbi on recently and talked about it. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, which I think is a really really perceptive book, and it's a really disturbing thing that he's describing. That there are good things about it, that that the media has gotten this fractured, that that like what counts as crazy ratings is like, whatever 2% of who is like watching Walter Cronkite,
Yeah.
talk about the Vietnam War. But there are good things about that. I think that does create some more openings for for perspectives that wouldn't normally make it, because that wouldn't normally have much of an audience, because if you don't really have consensus media anymore, that like lots of people are watching lots of different things, and if you're half the time you're watching on an app or something anyway, so it doesn't even really seem that different, whether you're watching whatever, the Majority Report or CNN. But the really, really bad thing about it is what Taib is talking about, that all of the financial incentives of media companies are now to cater to like whatever little segment of the public watches them.
Yeah.
So if you're, if you're Fox News, that's like, scaring grandmas about immigrants or whatever. And if you're MSNBC, that could be like 5 straight years of Russia.
Yeah. Of Russia shutting off the power grid.
Yeah. Yeah.
As Maddo mongered.
Yeah, I know. Which is one of those things that it's like, can be careful about how I put this, because I don't want to alienate people in my life by naming names here. But there are, I certainly know I've had conversations the last couple of years with people I know in real life who, like they'll tell me stuff like this, like, oh yeah, my God, did you hear this thing? And and it'll be something on that level, like, oh, Russia was paying bounties for the soldiers in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
Trump knew about it and all this stuff. And so I'll like half the time I'll just kind of like hold back. Oh, that's interesting.
It's happy. I do think part of the backlash to Red Scare is a little Russophobic, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think that's out of the question. I mean, I think that it's, like in this like weird era where like you had the what was it? There was like Newsweek or Time or one of those had the that big picture on the cover of like the White House turning into the like onion dome.
The Kremlin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have lost their minds about that. So I think that could totally play into it. In some ways, I'd actually find that less disturbing than people branding it as fascist because they don't like the sense of humor, because that like makes me really worried. Because like, okay, like if you really can't take having like people making jokes that rub you the wrong way without flying off the handle and deciding that they're your bitter political enemies.
Yeah.
What hope is there that you'd ever reach out to anything outside of like a really small bubble of like people with all the same cultural sensibilities and all the same, everything.
Right.
But
that you'd ever actually be a threat to capital.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Because you're just not going to reach that many people because that's just a recipe for never being anything but a subculture. So yeah, I kind of hope it is the Russophobia.
I think it's an element, and it has to do with our humor. I think our sensibilities. I think are Russian American and kind of confusing for some people on the left or liberals.
Yeah. And that makes that makes sense. Like, and again, though, I think that if anybody, if anybody has made it with us all, who thinks that you're a fascist has made it with us to this point in the episode, then which is probably unlikely. But if any of them have, like I think this might be something that's that's worth that's worth reflecting on, right? Because it's like it's like, look, it's not it's one thing to say like, man, I really don't like that podcast, like the kinds of jokes that they make really annoy me, whatever, like that's not a big deal. There's lots of stuff
you can elect not to listen to it.
You could just not listen to it.
Yeah.
It's remarkably easy to not listen to a podcast that you don't like, which I know, is something that, I mean, seems like it should go without saying, but then like I see that these people on Twitter who like half of their lives are devoted to their like fanatical hatred of Chapo Trap House or whatever. And it's like, All right, I'm clearly missing something here, but yeah, so it's not a very it's not all a big deal to dislike a podcast. You know that they're like probably most podcasts I've tried listening to I haven't liked,
Yeah.
but uh, but it is like if you it is a think a little bit of a big deal to sort of immediately jump to the conclusion that anything that strikes you the wrong way um, is fascist, and that like you have like a duty politically to like try to like wipe it off the face of the earth or whatever.
Yeah.
Both because that's like a kind of disturbingly authoritarian way to see the world, but
Or
also
to beg tech corporations to do it for you.
yeah,
I
that's
get people in my mentions occasionally like adding Spotify, and I don't even see a dime from Spotify. Spotify's like
yeah,
practices are incredibly unethical, and I hope they do take me off. So
right. Yeah, that it's yeah that it's both like weirdly authoritarian behavior, and it's also just not something that should inspire you with confidence that you can ever like reach like the majority of the of the public, because like most people um and this is not to like say, this is not to like promote some sort of like flattening simplistic, Norman Rockwell stereotype of the working class or whatever. It's incredibly variegated, but like but most people in all of their different eccentric ways, right, are problematic in one way or another by the standards of internet left subcultures.
absolutely, yeah. The vast majority of people, if I told them about my kind of trials and tribulations on Twitter, would I think be very confused.
Yeah, well, that is as good a note as any to end on. In conclusion, the Dasha and Anna every week are going to be promoting the teachings of Otto Strasser version of National Socialism on Red Scare. Where can people find that?
Patreon.com/Red Scare, or wherever you get podcasts for free normally.
All right.